Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever RCSGD Volunteer Symposium. We're so glad for all of you who are here to support our volunteers today. We are incredibly proud of the work that they've accomplished this year, even during these trying times. They've put on a myriad of events, affirmations, and different kinds of programming. And also, I want to give a very special shout out to Marco, without whose guidance and mentorship this program would not have been possible. So it has been an absolutely amazing year for the RCSGD. We've still been able to reach a lot of different communities, regardless of whether or not we actually have the ability to be with together or not. So I'm really proud of what the volunteers have put together, especially in previous quarters. And we thought the most perfect way to showcase them is to have this symposium to show y'all how they have grown and the skills that they have acquired while they have been in this program. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Marco, our volunteer coordinator, to introduce our first symposium.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marco. I use he, him pronouns. I am the RCSGD's volunteer coordinator for this year as well as next year. These 6 lovely folks that we have in here are our volunteers, and they've been, as Dwayne said, working really hard on different events, and we so appreciate them. It's bittersweet to see them go, but also with all the work they've been doing, really glad that y'all will finally have a long enough break to hopefully relax and recover and get ready for all the events that happen next year and whatever you choose to do. With that being said, I think let's start with an introduction of our volunteers. So we'll just go ahead and do maybe some names, pronouns, and then if you want to do year and major, and then we can go ahead and pass it off. So our first volunteer I'll be introducing is Anastasia.
Hello, my name is Anastasia Senvasky. I'm a first year. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an art major, and I am very excited to be here.
Do you also want to tell them your position for next year?
Oh, my position for next year is actually marketing coordinator. So, yay, okay. Very excited. I'm very, very excited to be part of the team. Okay, should I popcorn or?
I can go ahead and pass on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And also, congratulations, and we are more than happy to have you. Our second volunteer that we'll be introducing is Michaela.
Hi, guys. My name is Michaela. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am also a first year, and I'm a writing and literature major. And my position next year will be an office assistant, and I'm super, super excited about it. So thank you, guys.
Congratulations to you as well. We look forward to seeing you next year. Our third volunteer we'll be introducing is Helen.
Hi, everybody. My name's Helen. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a third-year history major. And this is my third year with the RCSGD. And I'm so excited for you guys for your new positions. Next year is going to be amazing. Congratulations, everybody.
Thank you so much for sticking around with us, Helen. It's lovely having you. Our fourth volunteer we'll be introducing is Marisol.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marisol Ramirez. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a fourth year, and I'm double majoring in film and anthropology. And I'm very excited to be here and to see everyone's presentations.
Thanks so much for all the work that you've been doing, Marisol. We really appreciate you. Our fifth volunteer we'll be introducing is Maggie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm brain sciences major, and congratulations on everybody in their new positions. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I really appreciate you, and good luck with all the psychology stuff. And our sixth final volunteer, but not the last one in our full cohort, reminder that we do still have Dorian and Julie, whose videos are up on our YouTube. Our final volunteer we'll be introducing is Shelsea.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelsea, pronouns they, she. I'm a fourth year political science major with a minor in feminist studies, and I'm happy to be here as well.
Thank you so much, Shelsea. Congratulations on graduating. I wish you the best of luck for all of your future plans. And thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing so far. All right, with everyone being introduced, I'm going to go ahead and toss it to our very first presenter. Anastasia, if you could share your screen, we would love to see it.
No problem. Okay. Don't mind all that. Okay. I'm going to turn on closed captioning. If the captions, I tested this out a little bit earlier and the captions were a little not exactly what I was saying, but we're going to try it out. Okay. Like I said before, my name is Anastasia Senvasky. I'm a volunteer at the RCSGD. Today I'm going to be presenting on LGBTQ foster youth and some of the disparities and importance of what that means in the community. Just a quick content warning. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has some themes of abuse, neglect, or violence. If you're at all sensitive to ideas of, like people getting out of bad situations, that is something that I'm maybe going to be going over today, and you're feel free to step away at any time if you feel that that is necessary. Okay, so the issue is that LGBTQ youth are absolutely disproportionately overrepresented in child welfare systems and foster care. A study from 2019 showed that 30.4% of youth in the foster care system identified as LGBTQ. This is drastically different from the percentages of youth that are not in the foster care system. These statistics were taken from California Fresh, like California Child Fresh survey that they put out in K through 12 schooling. And it showed that only 11.2% of children that were not in the foster care system identified as LGBTQ. Another thing that is very concerning is that 5% identify as transgender, whereas that statistic in comparison to people that are not in foster care is only 1.17%. An important thing to note is that these studies do not take into account other gender identities besides transgender and cisgender, so that identity is not going to be reflected in some of these studies, and the amounts could be larger. Some of the effects of this is that these children that are in foster care are fleeing bad situations, coming out of unstable housing, coming out of homes that they don't feel safe in, and that leads to homelessness. That leads to being put back in these situations that they're finding are unstable. And over 40% of homeless youth in America identify as LGBTQ. That is an outstanding statistic. That is absolutely abhorrent. And 25% of students that were surveyed stated that they were in unstable living situations. 25% of them are LGBTQ. An unstable living situation can be defined as any situation that is not a traditional home. You're not sleeping on a traditional bed. You're living in a car, motel, a relative's house, a friend's house. What makes this extremely shocking is that these lead to runaways. These lead to very unsafe situations for minors to be put in, and non-discrimination laws within the foster care system. Facilities across America don't necessarily have to have non-discrimination laws. In fact, an outstanding majority of the states in America have no non-discrimination laws for LGBTQ youth in the foster care or child welfare systems, which is very disheartening. What can come out of having an unstable living arrangement is acts of violence, of heightened risk of harm, and even sexual exploitation. The disparities are even more so heightened for youth that are Black or transgender. this has a huge impact on how transgender or Black youth are able to go throughout. I'm sorry. This has a huge impact on how LGBTQ youth are able to maintain their schooling, or maintain their mental health, maintain their physical safety. When you do not have a home to stay in, or you're lacking parental figures, or those figures are not your biological parents, that gives you a heightened risk of bodily harm to you. This also has a major effect on the amount of children that are going into the juvenile justice system. Those who identify as LGBTQ are twice as likely to be placed in the justice system. I think it goes without saying that youth that are placed in the juvie system are more likely to stay within that environment and have a harder time escaping these disparities when they come into adulthood. I'm gonna show a quick video from a human rights organization, and there are captions on the video, but I'm not sure if the captions will show on Google Slides too, but.
We're not hearing the audio. I'm not sure if you need to click the button when you share your screen for the computer sound.
Okay. Do I need to stop sharing for that?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, go to reshare it and click the.
There we go. Thank you for that.
I do it all the time.
I was
Can you hear
diagnosed
now?
with cancer when I was 9 or 10.
Okay, thank you.
My mother was my best friend. She passed away like a year or two after she was diagnosed. I came back to live with my mother's sister, and then I came out to her, and she put me into a facility.
What we have found is that many children come into foster care because their families are unable and unwilling to accept who they are.
All Children, All Families is a program of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation that provides resources, training, and technical assistance for child welfare organizations so that they can better serve the LGBTQ community.
People who work in foster care need to learn about gender identity, sexuality, all of that. It's like, they always feel like, we have to hurry up and house these kids so they don't end up homeless. It doesn't matter if they have somewhere to stay if that person isn't going to be affirming of their identity. You put this queer foster kid in this situation where they have to choose between safety and validation, which are both safety issues.
The All Children, All Families program gives us an opportunity to not just train staff, but to look at our procedures and our policies and our practice. We are hopeful that what we're doing will transform the delivery of child welfare services to our LGBTQ youth.
At the end of the day, All Children, All Families is working towards the same mission as the child welfare organizations that we partner with. We do this work to make sure that no young person feels isolated or alone.
I knew many years ago that I wanted to be a father. I even had names already picked out. Being with him opened me up to be loved and to see that I had love around me.
We decided to open up our lives and our home to foster. When we went into the agency,
I was nervous.
I was nervous. I didn't want to be discriminated against. I didn't know how we'd be received.
We want to recruit people who are going to be supportive resources for our young people, regardless of how they identify.
All Children, All Families helps to bridge the gap between agencies who need more foster and adoptive parents and the many LGBTQ adults who are interested in foster parenting or adoption.
Okay, so that video just described one experience. This particular organization does a lot of work. There's lots of resources online, and I'm just about to get to how we can help. What can we do to actively help on campus at UCSB? For staff, instructors, and professors, providing open spaces is extremely important. Having spaces that your students can understand are safe places to go to. Understanding the resources that are given to you and providing them when necessary is an extreme asset in providing that safer space and also giving the correct opportunities to youth that might need it. Also, responding to the specific needs of transgender youth. This has more to do with if you are trying to work within specifically child welfare or foster care, but it also goes back to just making sure that you're aware of those resources that you need to be providing students. Those that are transgender and within the child welfare and foster care system are largely discriminated against and not able to get the right hormone treatments, not able to get proper medical care. So having at least some open communication about that and understanding that that is an issue as an instructor or staff on campus is also important. For students, support your professionals, support the people that understand these needs and also hold these professionals accountable. Respecting boundaries of your fellow students by getting familiar with your resources. You don't necessarily always have to provide these resources, but getting familiar with what's on campus. One very cool resource on campus that we have here is the Guardian Scholars Foster Youth program on campus. I will say that there are less than 200 members, but it is an organization on campus that helps get people that were in foster care above the age of 13 proper resources and aids and grants on campus at UCSB. So that is an opportunity you can get involved in if you're interested in that or if that applies to you. Volunteer and joining causes that relate to this experience. Like I said before, specifically the Garden Scholars organization on campus only has under 200 members. So this, and there are no official communities on campus that cover both the needs of people that were placed in child welfare or had unstable living situations and those that are LGBT, because it is such a small, even though it makes up a large portion of that population of the people that were in foster care, it is a smaller demographic than what meets the needs of overarching LGBTQ identities. So when events are held that talk about these specific issues, it's important to show up. It's important to speak out when programs or workshops are being held that speak on these specific issues. For everybody, joining and creating or opportunities for connection, like I just said, going to these workshops, going to these symposiums and hearing what people are presenting on is very important. Also, physically displaying your support. I have a couple buttons that I put up on here, but physically displaying your support goes back to providing a tangible, safe environment that people recognize as an area that they can feel comfortable in. How to help online, there's a lot that you can do online. Getting online and getting involved in researching different organizations is very important. If you want to donate, that is also amazing. Some of the Organizations that I thought were most helpful were the Trevor Project, Lost and Found Youth, True Colors United. I will say True Colors United is actually an organization that helps homeless youth, but they have a whole team dedicated to specifically LGBTQ youth. And obviously all children's, all families, like we had seen in the video before. By donating, that doesn't just mean donating monetarily, that can also mean donating your time, volunteering, showing up, going to workshops from these organizations also helps support them. Spreading resources and spreading awareness, whether that be online, whether that be word of mouth, recognizing the resources that are available to you and relaying that information when appropriate is an extremely effective way of helping these communities. These are my sources. I really hope that you enjoyed my presentation. I'm so sorry for stumbling over my words a few times, but yes, thank you again. I hope everybody learned something at least. Right.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, for that wonderful presentation. Definitely very important to talk about, very important to spread awareness about. So once again, thank you so much. Our next presenter will be Michaela. So if you could also share your screen and begin your presentation.
All right, can you guys see my screen all right? Okay, cool. Give me just a sec. Gonna double check all things. All right, our closed caption's working. Fantastic, hold on just a sec. I'm gonna let my dog out of my room. All right. So hi everybody, I am super excited to be here. My name is Michaela, I use she, her pronouns. And I am so excited to talk to you guys about sex education and how it impacts the QT community. So we're going to cover a lot today. Hopefully it won't be too overwhelming. We're going to talk about sex ed, within the United States specifically. And then we're going to move into how it impacts the queer community specifically. And I'm checking the chat real quick. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's what we're going to cover. I'm super excited to talk to you guys. I'm going to include just a smidge of audience participation. So I'll just be asking you guys to answer a couple of questions in the chat, just like 1 or 2 word responses, nothing major. And of course, if you don't feel comfortable, don't even worry about it. So let's hop right in. So first thing, just to sort of give us a baseline as we move into discussing this. So I want to ask you guys, what do you think the goals of sex ed are? So this is a very broad question. As I said before, absolutely not a test in any way. But just what do you guys think from your own experiences or from what you think education should be? What do you think the goals of sex ed are? And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, give you guys 30-ish seconds to respond. Cool, love to see it. Yeah, Maggie, very valid. All right, so some of the answers I'm getting, just to keep everyone on the same page, are help folks practice safer sex, empowering people in a safe, healthy sexuality. Someone said in the US to prevent teen pregnancy. We're definitely gonna get on that and talk about that a bit, to get comfortable talking about sex. Fantastic. All of those are super great answers. Also, before I go further, I realized I didn't mention trigger warnings. Nothing in here should be too triggering, but we are going to be talking about sexuality and sex ed, which can be a bit of a traumatizing experience if you are in the QT community. So if that does not work for you, totally welcome to step away if you like. But wonderful responses. Thank you guys so much. So as we're talking about the goals of sex ed, getting comfortable with sexuality, talking about sex, all these things to help people stay safe, it's really important to keep those goals in mind when we think about what the curriculum of sex ed is and how it reflects some of those goals that we might have. So within the United States, sex ed generally falls under 3 categories in terms of how it's organized and how it's taught. And those reflect different goals depending on what they are and who's teaching them. So the first main category that we're going to talk about, sort of one end of the spectrum, and that's abstinence-only education. So abstinence-only is exactly what it sounds like. It teaches abstinence from sex, usually until marriage, as the only correct way to handle sexuality. It usually also includes some aspect of morality. There's some shaming language that's used in abstinence-only education, but it is hard stop, no sex until marriage, or bad things will happen. So the middle ground of the spectrum is abstinence plus education. So abstinence plus still emphasizes abstinence from sex, but it also includes some information about STIs and some information about contraceptive use within the context of abstinence. So the third category is comprehensive sex education, which is on the opposite end of the spectrum. And comprehensive sex education covers abstinence as the best way to prevent STI transmission and unwanted pregnancies. But it also talks about interpersonal relationships, contraceptive use, STIs, QT identities, consent, and how culture impacts the ways that we think about sex. So if you grew up in California and you were within the public education system, this is likely the form of sex education that you're familiar with, because that's what we have here in California. So these are the three categories. And one thing that's really important to talk about is that these categories vary widely by state. So something that I want to really hit home for you guys, there's no unified sex education curriculum on the federal level in the United States. So there are guidelines that exist that are created by the CDC, but they are not federal curriculum in that they're not required to be taught. So what that means is that decisions about the content and the emphasis of sex education are left to the state and local level. So that's where we see those differences between abstinence only, abstinence plus, comprehensive. They vary widely depending on where you are physically in the country. It also comes down to the local level, down to your school district. So even if you are in the same state, someone in Northern California may have a very different experience than someone in Southern California. And then on an even smaller scale, depending on your teacher and what your teacher is comfortable discussing or what your school wants to emphasize, you're going to have some variance there too. So point being, there's a lot of variance across the country. So when we're getting into how that specifically impacts the QT community, only 11 states and DC require that information about sexual orientation be covered, and only 6 of those states require that sex ed must be actively inclusive of QT folks. And then the flip side of that is that eight states include actively discriminatory language or lessons in their curriculum. So we're not looking too hot just on the curriculum level. And I do want to clarify that with these statistics, this doesn't mean that 40 of our states don't talk about QT identities. It just means that's not required within their curriculum. So just to clarify that statistic specifically. But yeah, so we're not looking too hot in terms of how well experiences are being represented in sex ed. So I want to ask you guys a question, sort of thinking back to your experiences maybe in middle school or high school. If you could describe your experience of sex ed as a QT person, one word, what word would you use to describe that experience? I'm gonna pop up in the chat. Yeah. So we've got inadequate, lacking, non-existent, yup. Yeah, non-existent. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry that this was your guys' experience. I also did not have a great experience, but I had some content. So yeah, across the board, not fantastic. We've got a lot of resounding non-existent. So I hope it helps you guys a little bit to know you are not alone. So less than 5% of QT youth have reported having health classes that portrayed QT topics in a positive light. So this information is from a survey from 2013, so it's a little bit of an old data, and we can expect that that number has hopefully grown a little bit, but curriculum takes a long time to change, so we are probably looking at something similar to this number. But yeah, reflecting your guys' experience, it is simply not something that is covered very often, which is really unfortunate for a lot of reasons, obviously, as QT people. But the other thing that's super important to acknowledge is that for a lot of students, sex ed is where we first start talking about sexuality and where you first start thinking about those subjects, especially within an educational context and not just poking around online or making jokes with your friends. So it's really unfortunate that this is something that is not covered very frequently, since it is such a good opportunity to get folks talking and thinking about this in a safe space. So the QT experience of sex ed, some of the major issues that we hit is just what you guys mentioned. I'm so sorry, my dog is in and out today. As a lack of discussion about QT identities and experiences. So limited discussion about what those identities are outside of just the acronym, or even not touching the acronym. And beyond that, not talking about what those experiences are like within the broader culture in the United States and within peer relationships and within romantic relationships. So just a very limited, if any, discussion about QT identities and experiences. The other big one that can be really problematic is focusing on HIV and AIDS as the context in which we talk about QT experiences. So if your sex education does cover STI transmission, this tends to be the little box in your textbook that's like, also, this is a thing that exists, which is really unfortunate and also very harmful. It's something that happened to our community and is part of our history, but is really tough to talk about and very traumatic for a lot of folks. So it's particularly harmful for this to be the only context in which we talk about QT experiences, especially since it generally falls into a pretty negative light. The next thing that's really problematic is that there's little, if any, information about the use of contraceptives for same-sex couples. So even if there is conversations about condom use, there's not any conversation about dental dams or how contraceptive use may vary depending on the body parts involved, depending on the people. And that can be harmful and hurtful if you are a QT student in sex ed, but can be downright dangerous to not be able to communicate how to protect yourself between same-sex couples. The other big one is the use of gendered language when discussing body parts and reproductive systems. So especially for trans folks, non-binary folks, intersex folks, when we really focus on this is what women have and this is what men have, and we sort of have those classic worksheets. I don't know if you guys got those, but you got to label all the parts. It's uncomfortable for everyone. But aside from that, it can be really damaging and mostly just not showing the full picture of how biological sex and gender identity sort of cross. And again, what that means for intersex folks who don't necessarily have exactly what those worksheets look like. And then the last big one is little to no discussion about the damage of harmful myths and stereotypes. So as I mentioned before, sex ed is a fantastic opportunity to break down some of those myths and some of those stereotypes, because it's such a good space for an educational content, and unfortunately ends up being a place where a lot of those stereotypes can be reinforced rather than broken down. So the bottom line in terms of how we move sort of past the, oh, this really sucks, into more positive spaces is that all students deserve to have access to tools, information, and safe spaces to discuss sexuality. We've talked a lot about what your guys' experiences are, generally not fantastic. And then what we hope the goals are. So I noticed that you guys had a lot of fantastic goals of finding ways to talk about sex in a healthy way, being able to protect yourself and your partner. Even preventing teen pregnancy as a focus in the US, that's still something that's important and we need to sort of address. So those are some of the goals that we want, and all students have a right to that. And this is a matter of culture and is a matter of experience for QT folks, but it also really is a health issue. So moving into hopefully the more positive action-oriented section, what steps can we take to improve the system? So first and foremost, ending the gender segregation of sex education. A lot of folks, when they're taught sex education, boys go in one room and girls go in the other, which is hard from a gender identity perspective and alienating for trans folks, but it also doesn't foster a community or a space where everyone can learn about everyone's body. And it's really hard to know how to protect yourself or how to take care of yourself and your partner if you don't have access to the information that applies. So that's a big step and is not a super tough one to take from the education perspective. The next one is discussing QT experiences in the context of healthy relationships and families, not just sexual experiences. So this does come back to the HIV and AIDS discussion. classroom curriculums. So giving QT educators a space to discuss what their experiences are like, how they do their education, and really shifting the power dynamic away from someone who maybe doesn't have the best perspective to talk about those experiences, and giving the stage and giving the spotlight to folks who do. And if you guys are interested, there are some wonderful organizations out there that have fantastic resources that I can definitely share with you guys if anyone's curious. And then the final one seems pretty basic, but makes a huge difference, is educators creating a safe space for QT students in the classroom, shutting down hurtful language, bullying. Like I mentioned before, you know, sex ed is not a particularly wonderful experience for anyone. There's a lot of giggling, there's a lot of, oh my gosh, a lot of blushing from students, which is totally natural and totally normal. But what becomes problematic is when those behaviors start to move towards teasing and start to move towards alienating folks from a space of discomfort, but it becomes bullying and it becomes really hurtful and harmful. So educators making sure to shut down that behavior and shut down that language, especially in the sex ed content, but also just in the classroom in general, can make a really big difference. So those are some steps that we can take to improve the system. A lot of those have to do from an education perspective, and there are lots of organizations that you guys can reach out to or look into the curriculum if this is something that you're interested in. So here's my big stack of sources and links. And finally, thank you guys so much. This is a topic that I really love talking about and is something that I'm super passionate about. So if you guys are interested in more specific resources, I have a huge chunky document that has a bunch of stuff. So if you guys are interested, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you guys about it. Yeah, and then if there are any questions, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'm super happy to answer them. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I absolutely loved your presentation. I think it was very inclusive and yeah, it detailed a lot of steps that we could take in our education system for sex education to include QT people. So thank you so much again for spreading that awareness. I will go ahead now and toss it over to Helen, who will be our next presenter. So Helen, take it away.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. Let's get into it. So hi, everyone. My name is Helen. As I said, my pronouns are they, them. Today, I will be presenting to you all on some research that I did during winter quarter, actually, under Professor Chavez Garcia in the history department. I would highly recommend taking classes with her if you can. She's very LGBTQ inclusive and just a great professor in general. But what I researched was how LGBTQ youth experience harm through juvenile justice systems in their many forms. And that's what I will be talking about today. I do want to give content warnings in advance. We'll be talking about things like police and policing, youth homelessness, discrimination in schools, incarceration, transphobia and homophobia, as well as assault. So if at any point you need to step out, take a minute away from your screen, feel free to. Yeah, and with that, let's get into it. Super excited to talk to you all about this today. So just a little overview of what we will be covering in this presentation. We will be talking about the way that QT youth have a unique positionality as inherently criminalized due to increased contact with juvenile justice systems at disproportionate rates. Out children are really inherently criminalized in the US. Many states still practice outdated laws that don't protect children on the basis of their identities, which is an area where protection really is necessary. And youth are really subject to a variety of societal obstacles that land them in some form of incarceration at a disproportionate rate than to their cisgender heterosexual peers. Two of these unique positionalities that I will be talking about today are hostile school environments and housing instability and financial instability due to familial rejection, along with a variety of other reasons. So first I will be talking about those two positionalities and how they affect QT youth, and then I will go into how juvenile justice systems perpetuate harm and do not address specific needs of LGBTQ youth. Most of my data that I use for this presentation does not extrapolate racial identity in addition to LGBTQ identity, just simply because that data doesn't exist yet. But you're talking about US carceral systems, which always disproportionately represent people of color. So when we're talking this, you can assume that the majority of the populations I'm talking about are people of color. I do have some data that's extrapolated for that, but not all of it. So I just wanted to make that quick note before we get into our first topic, which is schools. So one of the biggest proponents of the LGBTQ youth prison pipeline is the US public school system. There are a lot of different factors in public schools that lead to LGBTQ youth contact with juvenile justice systems. To begin with, data demonstrates that the school to prison pipeline for UT students shows that there are higher levels of discipline for QT students in schools, but there are not higher levels of behavioral problems. So LGBTQ kids are overrepresented in suspensions, expulsions, and arrests at schools. Children are also policed for their gender expression through dress codes. And then in addition to that, often when they retaliate to bullies who are targeting them for their gender expression, they are punished as opposed to the bully, as opposed to the perpetrator of whatever that incident may be. And in addition to that, the suspensions and expulsions that are occurring at higher rates for LGBTQ youth in schools are really, really harmful. There's a 3 times higher chance of contact with the juvenile justice system in the next year for children who have been suspended or expelled as compared to children who have not experienced disciplinary action at schools. And then also discipline in schools is directly linked to worse grades, higher dropout rates, and increased contact with the juvenile justice system. As I mentioned, that 3 times point of data. Schools are really supposed to be a safe place for children to learn and be successful in their futures. And another aspect that kind of works against this for QT students, and specifically for QT-POC students, is student resource officers. If you went to public school in this country, there was probably a student resource officer in your school or an SRO. These are essentially police who are somehow allowed to work in schools. They can often carry guns and handcuffs. We see all the time viral videos of SROs assaulting minority students and non-resistant kids, arresting kids at school. These people really do not belong in schools. They do not make them safer. And this is a place where we see the intersection of QT-POC identities being highly targeted, because marginalized and minority communities are already targeted at higher levels by police. And then you add on that QT identity and you are at a lot higher of risk for contact with student resource officers in schools. So we can see how schools really are not safe places for children and often create a pipeline between contact with juvenile justice and attending public school. The next factor that I want to talk about in increasing risk to contact with the juvenile justice systems in their many forms is housing insecurity and financial insecurity. Queer and trans youth really have to navigate the risks of being out at home. Not all homes are welcoming, as I'm sure we all know. And all too often, these kids are kicked out of their homes after coming out, or decide to flee abuse, non-acceptance, any of these factors that may force children out of their homes. So this leads to a disproportionate number of LGBTQ youth on the streets. This is something Anastasia actually touched on. So only 7% of US children identify as LGBTQ+, but as Anastasia said, 40% of youth on the streets fall under the queer and trans umbrella. So this is a hugely disproportionate rate of QT kids out on the streets. And living outside of shelter automatically increases interactions with the police, because homelessness in this country is inherently criminalized, especially in cities. One of the aspects of street policing that applies specifically to homeless trans people is the lasting legacy of the criminalization of trans people dressing to affirm their gender, which used to be referred to as cross-dressing. And there were laws previously, such as the law that said you had to wear 3 items of clothing that match your assigned gender at birth, right? This was something that used to be arrestable. This is no longer arrestable, but there are legacies of these laws that continue to harm LGBTQ youth, specifically trans girls and women as well. Scholars refer to this policing process that still exists today as walking while trans. This is a condition that homeless youth are exposed to at higher rates. It manifests in the hypersexualization of LGBTQ youth of color assumed to be sex workers. So police will see a trans woman or a girl walking on the streets, minding their business, going about the day, assume they are soliciting sex or are some sort of sex worker, and arrest as a result. And this is very, very frequent and much more pervasive than we would think. And then as a whole, just being on the streets at all is very criminalized. Some cities have curfews that make it impossible to follow the law and result in higher rates of incarceration and contact with police. And housing instability also forces children to partake in risk behaviors that increase contact with police as well. Things like sex work, drug dealing, stealing, panhandling, all of these behaviors are survival behaviors that take place when someone is in a crisis situation, but they are all criminalized actively. So we can see that by being out on the streets, which LGBTQ youth are out on the streets at much higher rates, there's this increased risk of contact with police. So this is really harmful. And then when we look at the contact with police, we really have to think about how cops are supposed to be crisis responders, but they are not equipped to be at all. They are not equipped to deal with the societal issues that lead to social, financial, housing crisis situations that put youth out on the streets. Police really just aren't educated or equipped to support these youth. So, for example, if there was an LGBTQ youth who was out on the streets, caught selling drugs, and the police would arrest this person, right? But what would really need to happen is for the underlying issues of financial insecurity that led this person to this crime to be addressed. But we're not dealing with those root issues. We're perpetuating the system of policing, where instead of dealing with root issues, we're just disappearing people into prisons, taking them off the streets, and we no longer see them. So we can see that cops really are not equipped to be the first responders to crisis situations. I also do want to mention the risk that police serve in mental health crisis situations. Calling the police on someone in a mental health crisis can be deadly, and often is. And LGBTQ youth on the streets, of course, are at higher risks for mental health issues because of the trauma that they've experienced. Police simply do not know how to respond to mental health crises and often respond with violence. They've become the first responders to youth in crisis. And I just really want to drive home the point that it is not safe, it can be deadly, and it is very dangerous to interact with a cop as an LGBTQ youth, or specifically as a QT youth of color. So, assuming that a person does make it beyond the initial contact with the police, the contact with the CPS, the contact with the SRO, whatever first brought them into contact with the juvenile justice system, then we can look at what happens upon entrance into these systems. So first I want to just go over the different forms of juvenile justice systems that we see in the US today. There are things like courts, prisons, juvie, halfway homes, even foster care and group homes. These are all carceral states that police LGBTQ identity and fail to provide for the needs of youth based on intersexual identity and individualized experiences. So I do want to, again, reiterate that we don't have all the numbers for all of these topics. Numbers are really just not there for LGBTQ youth populations across all of these institutions that I've mentioned, but I was able to find numbers for prisons specifically, prisons and juvie specifically. So a 2012 study that I found showed that 12% of incarcerated youth identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, so not including trans identity. And that same study showed that 39% of incarcerated girls identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Again, the larger youth population, 7% of the larger youth population identify as LGBTQ+. So we can see again, this is super disproportionate. Another study that I found from 2016, which was smaller and only surveyed across 3 counties, but I think still provides us valuable data, conjectured that when you include lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans and gender nonconforming identities, 20% of incarcerated youth have identified under this spectrum. And then here is one place where I do have data based on race. 85% of incarcerated LGBTQ youth are of color. So this is incredibly skewed and just reflects a larger issue of policing carceral systems in our country. All right, so moving on, I'm going to talk about next some of the issues that carceral systems have with properly supporting LGBTQ youth. So mental health resources are extremely lacking in all carceral institutions that LGBTQ youth come in contact with, and they're just incredibly critical for LGBTQ youth to have access to because of the huge amount of trauma that LGBTQ youth are more likely to have had. Childhood abuse, familial rejection, all of these things lead to higher risks of mental health issues. And so in order for LGBTQ youth to be successfully integrated back into society after whatever period of whatever type of contact they have with the carceral systems, they need mental health care and they need mental health support. Unaddressed mental health issues, which are super common in juvenile justice systems, lead to increased recontact with the system directly and longer stays within the system, which means that LGBTQ youth are at higher risks of longer stays and recontact in general. And then beyond mental health issues, particular struggles within the system are very, very individualized, very based on specific identity. Specific discriminations come with specific identities. There are larger trends, which on my next slide, I'll talk about a few of those. But it is very individualized, and we do need to realize that every experience is different, and there's not one catch-all way to describe the abuses that LGBTQ youth face in carceral systems. All right, so with this next slide, I'm going to be talking about some of the specific abuses that I saw across a variety of individual testimonies. This is where the majority of the trigger warnings come from, is this next slide. So just as a warning. So these are some of the unique targeted abuses that LGBTQ youth face in carceral systems across all different types of carceral systems, including prisons, group homes, foster care, all types of things. And these come from a 2019 study of 10 youth across New York City. This was done by interview process by the studier and then these 10 youth. I have this study listed at the end of this presentation. I would highly recommend reading it. It's very informative. But here are some of the abuses that people in these carceral systems faced. Corrective rape is very, very common, especially in group homes and foster care. There was one case I read of physical attacks, which were actually encouraged by other staff members in a group home based on identity. Something very common across all carceral systems for trans people of all ages is placement into facilities that do not match their identified gender. Prison systems in this country, of course, are segregated by gender. And so this, first of all, does not leave space for gender nonconforming people and often pushes binary trans people into the wrong gender grouping. In addition to that, an issue for trans people is withheld gender-affirming care and support. This is things like hormone therapy, medication, clothes, even makeup. These things are essential to the survival of trans youth. and their mental health in general. So when these things are not provided, it's very, very harmful. And it seems like something that is less violent than these other forms, but it really isn't. It's really denying a person's humanhood. And then finally, as I mentioned before, a lack of mental health care and mental health resources. All of these things lead to increased contact with the system, increased risk of recidivism. So it's really important that these issues are dealt with and changed from the inside comes. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, it's just examples from this study of 10 youth. But they're really telling of a systematic problem that we have across this entire system. There's, in addition to lack of support, there's increased abuses against LGBTQ youth. So what can we conclude from this? What are our big takeaways? I can in no way cover the extent of injustices faced by LGBTQ youth that predispose them to contact with the juvenile justice system. There really just aren't records yet explaining the scope of the problem. But a recent trend of interest in this issue has begun to reveal some of the trends creating disparities in the system. We talked about some of these today, some of the things that lead to increased risk of landing in the juvenile justice system: familial rejection, homelessness, childhood trauma, over-policing. All of these factors create a ripple effect in the lives of LGBTQ youth that goes beyond that moment and often leads to placement in juvenile justice systems. In these systems, children report assault, discrimination, lack of gender affirming care, social ostracization, all of which are factors that create worse outcomes in an already flawed system. So how do we need to look at this in the future? How can we serve our communities? The only way that we're going to be able to right these wrongs and prevent these injustices from happening is using an abolitionist lens and pushing for prison abolition. There's no reason that LGBTQ youth should be put into carceral systems as a result of personal trauma, personal struggles, any of those things. Prison systems cannot and will never serve our community. And so the big takeaway from this is that we really need to push for an abolitionist future. That is the end of my slides. I do have my list of sources here if you're interested in reading any of the research that I did. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any, but with that, I will end it here.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation, Helen. Definitely very informative, very harsh reality, but also very important to talk about because it is a reality that we face. So thank you again. So next up on our list of presenters, I have Marisol. So if you are ready, please go ahead and share your screen and begin your presentation.
Okay, I'm doing my presentation on Canva. So for the closed captioning, I don't know how, do you want me to do something on my end or?
Do you not see the option to turn on closed captioning on the bottom of the screen?
On Zoom?
Yes.
I don't think so. Where is it, like?
Yeah, it should say CC at the bottom, but if it does not, that is on me. My apologies. Please go ahead and continue your presentation and we'll go ahead and add that in the future.
Okay, sorry. Oh, hold on. Okay. Is that there? It's good? Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Marisol Ramirez, and I'm going to be presenting on how the gay liberation movement shifted towards rainbow capitalism. And I'm going to be contextualizing this through Pride. So Pride began as an homage to the Stonewall riots of 1969, which launched the revolutionary gay liberation movement. However, current day Pride events have very little resemblance to the original demonstrations, and instead are filled with corporate entities and a large police presence, who the riots were originally against. So that transition in the Pride events is reflective of the shift of the gay liberation movement as a whole. So I'm going to be tracing how that happened in this presentation. So as I mentioned, Stonewall was the key event that helped launch the gay liberation movement. And after Stonewall, a number of radical orgs were formed, such as the Radical Lesbians, the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, aka STAR, and the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF. And I have this quote here. It's about the GLF, but I think it's a good representation of what the gay liberation movement stood for as a whole. So some key parts of the quote, I have the US military and industrial complex was not something to reform, but rather to destroy and replace with a system of equality and justice. They understood that their gay rights would be nothing but privileges for the well-to-do unless we acted for the most vulnerable, most easily victimized queers. And this is from Ferd Egan, who was a leader in the gay liberation movement. He was part of the Chicago GLF. So they believed liberation would only come with social revolution and the abolition of existing social institutions. A majority of their work was community oriented. They had community centers for educational and social purposes. They provided housing, they provided medical care, and they had ties to a variety of the radical social movements that happened in the late 60s and the early 70s. So the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, women's movement, workers' movement. So this acknowledged that within the queer community, there was a lot of intersecting identities, and they had different needs that needed to be addressed. So in the late 70s and the 80s, the militancy of the movement started slowing down. While there were still militant radical groups that existed, during the AIDS crisis, their focus turned more towards survival and ensuring the health of the queer community. A lot of focus had to be in bringing much needed attention to those affected by the AIDS epidemic, and a lot of liberation activists passed away during this time. And at the same time, some members of the GLF were put off by the ties to the various other movements that the gay liberation movement had. They saw this as divisive. So they formed more conservative single issue groups that worked more within political channels, the most prominent of which was the Gay Activist Alliance. This group laid the foundation for activists in the future to bring reform. So working more within political channels to get that reform. So at this time, the majority of activists who worked within political channels were white, cis, and male. So the face of the gay liberation movement turned white, cis, and male. And so, as I mentioned, they were able to win policy reform, specifically regarding bar raids and sexual regulation laws like sodomy laws. They ended up being limited wins that would leave out more marginalized members of the queer community. So they had a different approach to activism as opposed to the more radical orgs from the late 60s. So they wanted to advocate more for privatized rights that granted equal access to traditional social institutions. So fighting for the right to get married. They wanted to make gayness acceptable by portraying it as virtually the same as being straight, except for having a differential desire. And that ignores gender nonconforming people, trans people, and any other sort of alternative lifestyle that queer folk might participate in. And this is a more current approach, but advancing a post-gay rhetoric that describes gay equality as all but nearly achieved, which is simply not true. And so all of these approaches leads to the creation of a cis white upper class, middle class norm that that is more palatable to the mainstream. And so because this norm was accepted by the mainstream, alternatives and anyone who participated in these alternatives were suppressed. I forgot to mention the content warning. I mentioned policing and in the next slide. So it's in the next slide right here. So enforcing the norm was through policing and through the commodification of a queer lifestyle. So in policing, once gay bars that had predominantly white middle-class patrons were left alone, the raids ended, and sexual regulation was loosened and repealed, a lot of white gay activists withdrew from the fight against the police state. And unfortunately, this happened around the same time as the beginning of the war on drugs, which disproportionately affected low-income people of color. And the war on drugs also brought new sex offender laws that more heavily criminalize trans and gender nonconforming people of color, especially sex workers, more heavily than their white queer peers. And Helen already touched a lot more on the effects of policing on the queer community because we still see this today. I have one of the same statistics that they had. 85% of LGBTQ youth in juvenile justice facilities are people of color, and 8% of incarcerated adults identify as LGBTQ. And that might not seem like a huge number, but that's compared to the 3% of adults who identify as LGBTQ in the general population. So we can see that's a very skewed statistic. And the commodification of the queer culture and queer lifestyle was the other arm of enforcing this new queer norm. So once queerness was in the mainstream and once it was more accepted in the mainstream, corporations started looking for ways to profit off of this new niche market that had not been previously profited off of. So now today, a large portion of open queer life is commodified. So we see this through gay bars, through a lot of fashion and clothes that is associated with the queer lifestyle and with pride, as I had mentioned. And I know not everyone participates in all of this, but in the mainstream, the queer culture that we see in the mainstream is very heavily commodified. And this makes an open queer lifestyle more economically exclusive, as not everyone can afford to be constantly going to gay bars or even the entrance fees for pride. Additionally, corporations that are heavily involved in the queer community only sell and advertise allyship and acceptance. So very vague statements like love is love, just accepting, advertising that they are accepting of the queer community. However, that ignores the complex variety of other issues that queer people face. And there is no real support that these corporations provide for the queer community. So the two companies that I have on this slide are Gilead and Absolute. And Gilead is the pharmaceutical company that developed PrEP. And while that is a very important life-saving medicine, it is highly inaccessible. It's in the thousands of dollars without health insurance. So if you don't have health insurance, it's unaffordable. And they won't release their patent so that other companies might make the same drug for a cheaper price. They're constantly locked in legal battles over that. So although they've developed this medicine, it's not given to everyone who could benefit from it. And with Absolute and alcohol in general, different alcohol companies, they were some of the first to start campaigning towards the queer community. And not only did it kind of infiltrate a historic part of the queer community, which is the nightlife, but it's also almost irresponsible to be heavily marketing alcohol as such a permanent fixture of the queer community, considering the large number of queer people that struggle with substance abuse. So as I mentioned, Pride is kind of a microcosm for all of these different transitions and all these different shifts. The various corporations that attend Pride often have practices that are completely oppositional to the original ideologies of the gay liberation movement. I have some examples here. I know obviously these are not the only sins of these corporations, but that is kind of just to summarize what some of them participate in that are completely against the first ideals that I showed in the first slide. And the large police presence at Pride is completely antithetical to the beginning of Pride and why Pride started. And additionally, arrests continue to happen at Pride, particularly of Black and transgender activists who go to protest what Pride has become, or there's been instances such as burning a Blue Lives Matter flag and they were arrested for that. So the presence of cops at Pride makes it a more dangerous event for trans and people of color. And so this all seems very negative, but to try to start combating rainbow capitalism, there are, specifically with Pride and Pride events, there are groups across the country, such as the Reclaim Pride Coalition in New York and No Justice, No Pride in DC, that hold demonstrations that are more reflective of the first Pride marches that occurred post-Stonewall. So they are more egalitarian, it's not like a parade. And they also do actions like blocking police and weapons manufacturers from the Pride parades. We can also refocus on building community like we do here at the RCSGD. So holding more educational workshops and just strengthening community, the queer community wherever we are. And a refocus on strengthening the a refocus on the intersecting identities within the queer community and what their needs are, and how to address them. So addressing racism, housing issues, medical issues, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm hopeful. I see a lot of this growing within the queer community and within queer activism. So hopefully that can continue to grow and continue to combat the rainbow capitalism that has infiltrated the queer community and queer lifestyle. And so this was a very general overview of rainbow capitalism and how it affects, or how it is manifested and taken form within queer culture. But hopefully it was a good general overview. And that's my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I have my sources here, 2 different slides. So, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What made you decide to do your presentation on this? Why is this so important to you?
I specifically with the commodification of queer lifestyles, I think it's very, it's ingenuine, first of all, considering that all these corporations are just trying to sell us things and not really providing any sort of support in return. And it's disheartening to learn about what the movement was in the beginning versus what it's become because of such heavy commodification. So yeah, that's basically why.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Definitely an important conversation to have about knowing the roots of where the movement started and going into what it's become with rainbow capitalism, and also how it's starting to change and how we want it to look in the future. So thank you again for your wonderful presentation and your great answer. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to our next presenter, Maggie. So please go ahead and share it when you are ready.
All right. Okay. Let me turn on the closed captioning. Okay, sorry. So hi, everybody. My name is Maggie. My pronouns are she, her. I am a 2nd year here at UCSB. I'm majoring in psych and brain sciences with double minors in applied psychology and poverty, inequality, and social justice. And today, let's talk about bi erasure, because it happens. So in my presentation, we're going to talk topics we're going to cover. First of all, defining erasure, bisexual bisexual identity erasure, biracial identity erasure, flexibility, and the resources available. So before I dive into my presentation, I just wanted to talk about how this certain topic is really personal to me. They relate to my identities. So I'm biracial and bisexual. I'm Mexican and Filipino, so I'm very proud of that. And I have actually been subjected to bi erasure in general of both of my identities. So a lot of the things that I've talked about, I will be talking about in this presentation, I've experienced personally. So just a heads up on that and why I'm talking about this topic in the first place. So let's dive in on what is erasure. Okay, so what is erasure? It's the practice of collective indifference that renders certain people and groups invisible. And of course, erasure is just a bad thing in general, can lead to terrible mental health, low self-esteem, people feel invalidated, they become unsure about their identity. So the suffering communities, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ plus community, other minorities, their talent, accomplishments, and contributions often go ignored, underrated, or they somehow get lost in cultural history. And examples of erasure is a sentence just as simple as that doesn't exist or that doesn't happen. It's a very simple sentence, but it's writing off the existence of these issues, of these communities, of their accomplishments, things that they've worked on. So the first identity we're going to dive into is bisexuality. So 1.8% of adults identify as bisexual, with over half of the LGBTQ community identifying as bisexual. That's such a big, you must be thinking like, oh my God, that's such a big community. How does a whole community like that just get erased? It's a lot crazier than it sounds, but it happens quite often, and we'll touch upon that later. So bisexuality erasure kind of stems from certain stereotypes that influence it. So let me dive in on that. So we have this flamboyant stereotype of the bisexual. The bisexual that's so flamboyant, they're super laid back, super out there. They kind of, if you're seeing them in media, they're sort of sleeping with a male one episode and then suddenly they're swapping to a female, or sometimes they'll be portrayed with just coming out of a threesome, super flamboyant, leads to erasure. Then there's the indecisive stereotype. The bisexual is just confused about their identity. They were really straight the entire time, or they were actually gay the entire time. Or the promiscuous stereotype. Bisexuals will just sleep with anybody that comes to them. These stereotypes encourage erasure through fitting people that identify as bisexual into these stereotypes. You're sort of labeling them and assigning them a personality before you even get to talk to them. So bisexual reception through other people. In a 2016 research article, it was found that all participants were more positive towards bisexual women than bisexual men. There was a relative lack of positive attitudes towards bisexual individuals in general. So this study kind of had people rate how comfortable they were with bisexuals, with lesbians, with men that were gay. And bisexuals had the lowest positive rating, and bisexual men were rated way lower than bisexual women. So if you're a bisexual male and identify as that, you're less, I'm so sorry about that. You're just not going to be received well by the general public just because of your gender identity, or not your gender identity, your sexual identity. And then there's just a lack of bisexual representation and things outside of the media. So real people are less inclined to be out about their bisexuality just because of the stigma and harmful stereotypes. So when you think of politicians are less likely to come out as bisexual, and thinking the most stereotypical scenario where a politician is found cheating on his wife with another man in a hotel room. That politician is less likely to come out as bisexual just because he might not get elected. Also in the film industry, actors aren't going to come out as bisexual because this is a really obscure fact that I know, but if you do not identify as queer and you play a queer character, you actually get paid more. So yeah, it's crazy. Definitely, that's one incentive not to come out as bisexual. If you can get paid more to pay those bills, there's your incentive. Education, teachers have a harder time coming out as queer because parents don't want that, especially bisexual, where you're attracted to one or more genders, and that might be sort of confusing for a child to understand. So all of these stereotypes and the stigma behind bisexuality leads to lower representation in fields outside of the media. And then just some examples of bisexual erasure. They were gay the whole time. Have you ever dated a blank though? They were just confused. These are all examples of erasure. So now jumping on to our next identity, biracial. So being biracial in the US, biracial individuals make up 7% of the population, and that percentage is expected to soar by 2050 to almost 25%. Most of the literature, and then there's a very small amount of literature conducted on those who are biracial/multiracial, focus on the benefits of being multiracial, such as being more intelligent or being perceived as more attractive. There's also biracial stereotypes of the beautiful mix, or just stereotypes where, oh, biracial individuals are just confused, or their cultures hate each other, and that causes conflict in the family. Biracial is such a broad umbrella term, since so many races and so many ethnicities could be combined in a family. So each biracial individual has their own unique experience. So an individual that is mixed with Black and white has a completely different experience from those that are mixed with Asian and Hispanic. There's also fluidity within biracials, just maneuvering between certain spaces, sort of masking what may be appropriate in one culture is not appropriate in the other. So just some biracial stereotypes. The good mix. The implication of a good mix means that there might be a bad mix out there. That's also an example of fetishization, of mixing races and hoping you get the desirable features from each race. That biracial individuals are culturally indifferent. Just because there is a mix of two different cultures, biracial people just might not have any and just grow up in generic American culture. That is a stereotype that is untrue. And then another stereotype is not belonging in either racial group. That is also incorrect. Most biracials do feel that they do belong in their racial and cultural groups, and that they're not necessarily half of something, half of another, more that they're fully one of their identities and fully of the other. So I consider myself fully Hispanic and fully Asian, because sort of implying that I'm half means that I don't have the full experience of both, when that is not true. So 1 out of 5 biracial individuals reported feeling pressured to claim a single race, and nearly 1 out of 4 reported feeling confused. So these sort of pressures, these external pressures from society, sort of starts these feelings of doubt about your identity. This is something I personally felt when I enrolled at UCSB. I was really confident and sure of my cultural identity, and suddenly I felt sort of pressured to pick one, and that I couldn't necessarily identify as both because I was not perceived as both. And yes, I think I am a part of the 1 out of 4 that report feeling confused. Bisexuals also have a sort of mental flexibility. In a 2015 study, Dr. Gay found that from a young age, multiracial children learn to switch seamlessly between their racial identities or multiple identities in general. This also was not necessarily, what's that word? It wasn't exclusive to biracial individuals. You sort of have to like prime people to say like, oh, you are this identity and this identity. So through multiracial individuals, they discover that once you prime somebody to remind them of the multiple identities they hold, they're actually able to remember better and just things like that. And some examples of biracial erasure. You're basically blank though, right? Filling in the blank. I've had somebody say, oh, but you're basically Mexican though, right? And I was like, no. Yes and no. You don't look blank. This is sort of, it doesn't, I know that it's not made in a super like mean intent, but when you kind of think about it, you're pulling what a certain race looks like through stereotypes, or even just I couldn't tell. That's a form of erasure because you're erasing that person's race, their culture, because you can't see it physically, or even you don't know how to see it physically. So you might be wondering, okay, you talked about two different identities. How do they tie together? So the intersection is that these identities are not mutually exclusive. Somebody can identify as biracial and bisexual. What I want to talk about is the similarities between the two, and definitely how usually when there are biracials portrayed in media, they are never bisexual as well. And bisexual individuals in media are never portrayed as biracial. It's sort of interesting how these identities are kept separate, although they have many similarities in masking, being flexible, dealing with the erasure between your identity as well as your sexuality. Another thing they have in common is the fetishization. So there's the bisexual unicorn, somebody that you're waiting for to have that threesome with your girlfriend, or the beautiful biracial of picking apart desirable traits from each race and hoping to have a good mix, or that most biracial are just perceived as more attractive because of the averageness. So let's talk about some resources. So for bisexual individuals, we have the Bi For Us discussion group here at the RCSGD. There's Biolog in Santa Barbara, there's the Trevor Project, and there's just the RCSGD in general. There's that space for queer students. However, for biracials, we have online articles. And there are a couple, by a couple, I mean exactly two organizations on campus for biracial and multiracial individuals. But ultimately, there's not a lot of spaces. There's not a lot of discussion about the biracial experience. And this is insane since it's such a large and growing population. And there's hardly any research on it. There's hardly any groups. Most of these online articles are about broken families or dealing with internal family racism. So it's pretty sad. So after all this presentation, you might be wondering, what now? And I just sort of sassily put, do what you want. You could tell others, don't tell others, forget about everything. This is mostly from one of my favorite biracial authors, Thomas King, where after he finishes his stories, he goes, well, the power is in your hands now. I've spoken my piece and I shared a little bit of my experience being bisexual and biracial, and why I wanted to talk about it at this particular symposium was just to bring more awareness that these conversations aren't happening and there's very little resources. So definitely something to think about. Maybe in the future, hopefully I can come back to UCSB and see that they have established a center of biracial individuals. That would be great. As of right now, that's not a resource I have available. So just some parting words. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Happy week 9 and good luck with finals week. And I hope everyone has a really great summer.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for that incredible presentation. Again, I really enjoyed that you talked about the unfortunate reality of erasure, both for bisexual individuals and biracial individuals, taking it into a intersectional lens, also providing resources and talking about how we move forward. So great presentation. With that being said, we're gonna go ahead and move on to our final presentation. So Shelsea, take it away when you are ready.
Hi everyone, I'm just gonna, okay, I already have co-host, so I'm just gonna pull up my slides real quick.
While we are waiting, I do want to thank everyone for holding on and paying so much attention to all of our volunteers' presentations. I know they all worked really hard on this all quarter, so thank you all for sticking with us. Also, if you ever need to get up, stretch, get some water, please go ahead and do so. We know that these are some hard topics, but also very important topics, so please take care of yourselves as well.
Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and present this real quick. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and present. Hi everyone, my name is Chelsea. Pronouns is they, she. I'm a fourth year graduating this quarter. So yeah, I'm just gonna present on resisting anti-trans legislation. And I just do want to give a content warning. There are a lot of cases of transphobia that inform public policy. A lot of like, yeah, transphobia that like really is rooted in this. So I just want to make that known. So feel free to step away and take the space that you need if you find that to be necessary. So I just want to start with this photo that says you can't legislate trans kids out of existence. The focus here of my presentation is on the effects, well, not the effects, but also the effects, but basically the targeting of trans youth in public policy, and which I'm going to dive deeper into as we move forward. So I just want to highlight first this law that just passed in Arkansas to really start the conversation, which is called HB 1570. So this year, Arkansas passed like this most tremendous bill that would basically bar healthcare professionals from providing transition-related care to trans youth. And it's expected to go into effect as early as July 28th of this year. Such a law would also bar trans youth from getting referred to other professionals who also provide gender affirming care. So if you go to a healthcare professional and they can't help you, they aren't allowed to recommend someone else to you. So you're basically like out of luck. And this would also bar state funds such as Medicare funds going towards gender affirming healthcare for trans people who are under 18 years old. And so where this leaves us is for families who are searching for gender affirming healthcare for trans folks in the state of Arkansas, they don't have the option as early as July 28th, which causes these families to uproot their whole lives basically in order to move somewhere else where they could find gender affirming healthcare for the trans youth in their families. So why is this important? So basically, the state apparatus is using its powers to police trans bodies, sorry, I spelled bodies wrong, and deny trans youth their bodily autonomy. This legislation is basically based on the premise that youth don't really know their bodies, identities, and etc., and are not capable of deciding of what feels right and good for them. A lot of the conservative logic, quote unquote logic, that's being used to argue in support of these harmful bills is that trans youth are too young to know their gender, that they're just going through a phase, and that they are too young to make these decisions that will affect them for the rest of their lives. And I also want to like highlight the fact that these bills are being passed by white cis people who aren't understanding the real experience of trans youth, especially trans youth of color. And also, like, this bill will negatively affect the mental health of these youth because if they can't have gender affirming care, that's like a very strong very important part of their identities to be able to feel comfortable and present and express themselves as the way they would like to. It also demonstrates the unequal power dynamics between adults and youth, where youth are portrayed as inferior and not cognizant of their role in society. Adults think that they always know best and that they have the right to make decisions for youth about their bodies and what they should do and stuff. But youth are really, really, really smart and really powerful in knowing what feels good to them, what is right for them. And so trans youth are currently like caught in this unequal power dynamic between adults who are making these decisions for their body versus them trying to resist these really transphobic public policies. And just reiterating, this law is an attempt to uphold white cisnormative narratives of being and navigating the world. This law really shows how who is considered like the right kind of person to be navigating the world, like what is considered right and being right. And so we're really trying to just highlight the fact that like there's so many like layers to this kind of public policy that has been passed. And so I wanted to really highlight that as well. And so I'm gonna play this short video. Let me know if you all can hear it. Okay, you can't hear it. Okay, let me pause share and then fix that real quick. Oh, share computer sound, awesome.
Arkansas passing a bill blocking gender-affirming care for trans youth. It would ban access to things like reversible puberty blockers and hormones. The deputy director for transgender justice at the ACLU calling it, quote, the single most extreme anti-trans law to ever pass through a state legislature. Joining me now, Joe Yerkeba, associate editor of NBC News Out. Joe, unless Governor Hutchinson vetoes this bill, Arkansas will be the first state to ban gender-affirming care for transgender minors. Tell us more about this bill and what it could mean for trans kids in the state.
Sure. So the bill would ban all gender-affirming care. As you mentioned, that includes puberty blockers, which temporarily pause and delay puberty to prevent the negative mental health effects that a lot of trans young people experience. And they're entirely reversible. It also includes hormones, which many young trans folks use once they begin puberty, and it will negatively impact their mental health, according to physicians that I've spoken with. One pediatrician already testified in front of the Arkansas Senate last week that she has already seen an increase in attempted suicides among young trans people that she has worked with.
Major medical associations support gender-affirming care. The president of the American Academy of Pediatrics actually coming out with a statement opposing the Arkansas bill. What else are medical professionals saying here besides some of the concerns that you just mentioned?
Medical professionals are saying that the bill also paints an inaccurate picture of what gender-affirming care actually looks like for minors. So there's a lot of focus in this bill on surgery, and minors aren't receiving surgery. They're often just receiving things like puberty blockers. They also are not receiving care without the consent of their parents or other medical professionals. They often usually have a team of providers, including mental health professionals, that are deciding what kind of care is best for them.
Arkansas is not alone here. What other states should we be watching? Where else are they considering similar measures?
Another measure is being considered right now in Alabama, and it's actually considered a more extreme bill than the one in Arkansas because it includes felony penalties for medical providers who provide gender-affirming care to trans youth. And it would also extend to people 19 or under 19 years of age. It would also ban coverage of gender-affirming care using public funds, so under Medicaid. And there's a similar bill being considered in Tennessee that would also include misdemeanor penalties against medical providers who would provide gender-affirming care.
All right, Joe, always appreciate having you on. Thanks for coming on with us today.
So yeah, as we can see, like there's a lot of very conservative lawmakers pushing forward these bills, not just in Arkansas, but in other states as well, and also providing severe penalties towards healthcare providers who are trying to build a bridge and trying to provide services to trans youth, which is really frustrating and sad to see. But it's not only just healthcare that trans youth are being attacked in. Trans youth are also being attacked in sports. So Tennessee and Idaho and West Virginia are some of the states in the country barring trans youth from playing on sports teams that they are most comfortable with gender-wise, that aligns with their gender identity. Idaho was the first state to bar transgender athletes from participating in sports teams that they would want to be a part of. According to the Washington Post, the legal battle over the state law is pending at the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And this was brought up by a cisgender athlete who challenged this policy. A federal judge also issued an injunction which would eventually prevent this from taking effect as it's being litigated. In addition to this, it's also received support from many Christian organizations that have backed this anti-trans legislation. And according to multiple reports, it's expected that this will ultimately reach the Supreme Court, which is really frustrating to see, because trans youth should just be able to be youth and to be to be able to do what other youth are afforded to do, which is receive basic health care, to have fun in like recreational things like such as sports and stuff. And so here we see a mom and their child like protesting, basically saying like, let our kids play, like kids should be kids and their bodies shouldn't be policed by the state, which is really, really frustrating to see. And so where do we go from here? And then this is just a sign from a protest, which says, trans and gender nonconforming youth, we love you, we see you, and we stand with you. And so where do we go from here? Asking ourselves, really, what are we doing for trans youth and uplifting their stories? How are we making space for them in our classroom, recreational spaces, etc.? Contacting and spamming our legislators when they pass anti-trans legislations like this, and really letting them know that what they're doing is really not okay, and that there's people and there's communities that will fight against this. And also, I just really want to highlight the importance of donating to and sharing mutual aid efforts that center trans folks, especially trans folks of color. Mutual aid is such an important part of community building, because it just demonstrates that, as we've seen time and time again, that the state can't take care of us and can't provide the resources. It has the resources, but chooses not to provide them for our community. So just emphasizing the importance of mutual aid as an act of resistance and a form of community building, and showing that we can develop community care and take care of each other in ways that the state could never. And that is the end of my presentation. Also, I will be taking questions in case anyone has questions, but thank you again.
Thank you so much, Shelsea, for your incredible presentation, and thank you for covering such an important topic that's, current and quite literally coming up. Like you mentioned, July 28th, a very important day for that bill to actually come into effect. So right now is the time to do that work. So thank you for presenting and spreading awareness. With that being said, that concludes all of our presentations. So I want to thank all of our volunteers for taking the time and effort to create those presentations and present for us. I know it can be very hard to talk about these harsh realities, so I want to thank you all for doing that. And also thank you to our audience who were all in attendance and stayed for as long as you could. Thank you for helping us by learning about this, and then also hopefully spreading awareness. We really hope that you got something out of our symposium. With that being said, I'll go ahead and toss it over to Dwayne if you'd like to do any closing remarks to close out our session.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to say what excellent, excellent presentations. We were able to see how much care was in these presentations, the amount of research that y'all did. These were absolutely incredible. And honestly, I hope y'all use these for classes. I hope y'all use these to create your own workshops in the future, your own professional development workshops in the future. Y'all have been absolutely amazing this quarter. It's been an absolute joy to be with this with the volunteer program. And I just cannot express how proud I am of all of y'all. Y'all have all grown tremendously, and I hope that y'all are able to recognize that among each other as well. So thank you all so much. And once again, Marco, you did such an amazing job this year. The first year being a volunteer coordinator, and you absolutely killed it. So your second year is just going to blow us out of the water. So thank you to everyone who was in attendance. Thank you to all of our volunteers. Thank you to everyone who came to support. We really, really appreciate y'all. And please enjoy your evening. It's a 3-day weekend. I hope y'all find some rest and solace this weekend.